Good morning, everybody. And thank you. Thank you for that welcome, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. I've had the privilege for the last 6 years of leading the only voice of opposition in the European Parliament. As you may have gathered, I'm not very popular in Brussels. They don't like what I have to say because they, in that Parliament today in Brussels, represent an entire generation of European politicians. They've been English, they've been French, they've been German, and what they've done is they have betrayed our nations, they have betrayed our democracy, and they have sold us out to a new bureaucracy in Brussels, and we're going to fight back against them. But there's been a slight problem. I've had colleagues from across the continent who are joining our great democratic struggle, but of course there's been nobody from Germany in the European Parliament standing up and fighting for democracy. And one of the reasons that I'm so pleased to be here this morning, is I see in this room, and I feel in this room, all the same things that we had when we founded the UK Independence Party 17 years ago. We started, like you, with a small number of people and a big meeting. We used to meet, often have a public meeting and 20 people would come, but we followed our crusade, we pushed our cause, and in 2009, in the European elections, we in UKIP came second across the entire United Kingdom, beating the government of the day, and I believe here that you have the potential to do exactly the same thing, and I wish you Godspeed. Now, of course, we are here because our excellent professors, two of whom we have heard from, have decided to take this challenge to the court. And it's a brave thing for them to have done, because it takes strength and courage to swim against the tide of the media, of your fellow academic colleagues. I'm sure you've been scorned for much of what you've said and done. But no, you are the visionary people. You are the ones standing up and fighting for democracy, and I'm delighted to be here today to support you. And of course, these empires of political union never, ever work. You know, if you travel across northern Africa, you'll see in Egypt the ruins from great empires that have gone before, right across Europe, right across the world. We've seen the formation of political unions, we've seen the submission of individual peoples to an empire, and all through history we see that multinational empires and political unions simply don't work. They don't survive. The Roman Empire's gone, the Ottoman Empire's gone, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has gone. They have disappeared. And you know, this European project has been forced upon us, and, by the way, I'm not making this up when I call it an empire. Mr. Barroso himself has described the European Union as an empire. So that is what they're trying to build. They tell us that this empire is a project for peace and prosperity. What they don't tell you is that this project is actually about an elite gaining more power for themselves. That's the truth behind this project today. So they push us together. They take 27 different nation states with different languages, different histories, different cultures, and without ever asking us what we think, they're trying to force us together into one state. And we're beginning to see the cracks at the edges. We're beginning to see that it's not really working, but they are desperate to continue with their mission. On his 80th birthday, Helmut Kohl, who I have to say is not my favourite European politician, Helmut Kohl, when he could see that the euro was getting into trouble, said, "European unification is a question of war and peace. The euro is part of our guarantee of that peace." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I fundamentally disagree with that analysis. I've always believed that the great pivot point of the last couple of centuries, really, was the disaster that was the First World War. And if you go to Verdun, which I've done many times, and I've taken parties and I've lectured on those battlefields, it's worth thinking about what that place represents. And of course, do you remember back in 1984, the enormous Helmut Kohl and the tiny Francois Mitterrand holding hands together? It looked like a comedy act, but it wasn't, because it was deadly serious. And they held hands together and they stood in front of that massive cemetery and that ossuary up at Douaumont, where those appalling battles had taken place, and they said never again. They said that the EU was necessary to prevent war ever taking place on the continent. What, of course, they forgot, or perhaps misunderstood, is that mature democracies rarely, if ever, fight each other. So what they were using people's genuine desire for peace to push towards a political union and to push towards the destruction of our national democracies. Now, I firmly believe that the reason that we've had peace in Europe in 1945 is because of a number of factors. I mean, firstly, frankly, I think people in Europe were sick of war by the time 1945 had come along. And of course, we had nuclear weapons. Now, I know this is not universally popular in Germany, but I do think the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons made a war with Russia much less likely. And of course, what we've had since then is NATO. Now, NATO is an example of sovereign states that group together and form an alliance. I support the principle of NATO. What I don't support is the principle of European Union, where far from nation states working together, what you do as a nation state is you give away the power to make decisions to somebody else. So that's one of the things, ladies and gentlemen, that we've got to push. We want peace, of course we do, and we'll get peace in Europe provided we have mature, functioning national democracies. And actually what is going on is very, very dangerous indeed. Because what is happening is we are being robbed of our identity. We are being robbed of our democracy. And if these movements don't work, if we are not able to get plebiscites across the European Union, then I am deeply fearful that far from the European Union being a project for peace, it will actually do something that our children and grandchildren may pay a very heavy price for indeed. Just think what we did in the Balkans in 1920 and 21. We took small, different, sovereign, independent states. We forced them together and called it Yugoslavia, and much as it may have held together for decades under a pretty repressive communist regime, in the space of the last 20 years, we've seen the most appalling atrocities in the former Yugoslavia as nations fight to get back their democracy and identity. The lessons from history are clear. You cannot force people together. You cannot create identity. You cannot create nationhood. That is something that the people themselves choose. And that is why this betrayal of your nation and your democracy is something that is of such fundamental importance that we must fight with all our might. And of course, in your country, it seems to me that the propagandists of the EU project have played heavily on German guilt about the war. And they've been able to do this because it's true. I mean, my wife is German. She's from Hamburg, and she was brought up to feel guilty. But quite why, age 44, she should be responsible for anything that happened in the past, I've no idea. But that factor has been present. But of course it's changing, isn't it? A younger generation is coming through who have no knowledge, no contact with the events of the past whatsoever, and why on earth should they? I think Germany is getting over its war guilt. And I think Germany as a country is becoming quite popular and quite trendy again. When the World Cup football was on, my wife put a big German flag at the front of our house. I have to confess I put a big English flag on the front of the house as well. And I do want to have, I must emphasize, I do want to have good relations personally with Germany and the Germans, although I thought the English disallowed goal in the World Cup was an absolute disgrace, I have to say. And I haven't quite got over that. But no, I can see there's some hecklers at the back. I thought perhaps there might be. No, Germany's become popular again. Lena won the Eurovision Song Contest. We've got a German, Joseph Ratzinger, as the Pope. I think that somehow this guilt is over. But there is perhaps one legacy of the war that you are left with, and perhaps in a way it's the basis of the case that the professors are taking to the German Constitutional Court. In a sense, the EU deal that you've got is in a way Germany's own form of war reparations, because you are paying the most enormous bill to support this European Union. You were paying an enormous bill in good times, but now we're headed for bad times. You're facing an absolutely extraordinary prospect. However bad the crisis may have seemed back in May, when Greece was in trouble and the bailout fund was put together, I'm pretty confident in saying that you ain't seen nothing yet. Because if there are problems in Greece, I think it's possible that the economic problems in Portugal and Ireland may in a couple of years' time be even worse than the situation in Greece. So this issue simply isn't going to go away, and frankly I think the German people have been taken to be the mugs of Europe. You're the ones that have been picking up the tab, and your politicians clearly are prepared to pay any price to maintain their European dream and their European project, and to hell with you, the people. So it's very, very apposite that you're here today. And the situation is getting worse because the ECB are busy buying up what are effectively junk government bonds in the marketplace, and this is going to lead to trouble. You know, the billionaire investor George Soros, who knows a thing or two about currencies, said due to its history, Germany is more worried about inflation than about recession. In the rest of the world, it is exactly the other way round. So I don't believe that Germany's interests are served by being part of this monetary union. I don't believe you can have Greece and Germany together in the same currency union. Perhaps in the end it will prove to have been just a cohabitation rather than a marriage. But I'm afraid your Chancellor Merkel seems to use every crisis that exists within the Eurozone or within the EU project, and she and her fellow fanatics, people like Martin Schulz, who leads the socialist group in the European Parliament and who simply can't control his rage and anger against me whenever I dare to say something against the project. But they really have manipulated this Euro crisis, and it's not just, of course, that you're being asked to bail out the countries in trouble, but there are now plans afoot to put in place a full economic government based in Brussels, whereby you as a nation would even have to submit your budget every year to the unelected European Commission for approval. So that's the way we're going. And I have to say that it is time the Germans stood up and said that you've simply had enough. You're not going to pour any more money into this system. And you of all countries, I mean, you are proud, I think, of what you've done in the last 50 or 60 years. You've worked hard. You've built a good economy. You've believed in the principles of sound money. And now you've been merged with countries with a Mediterranean climate and culture who look at things entirely different. It isn't that you're better than them, and it isn't that you're worse than them, but it is that you are different to them. And you should be managing your own country, your own economy, in your own interests. This whole project This whole project, the euro, it wasn't about economics, you know. It was always about politics. It was about forcing people together. Now, clearly it's not working. Clearly it isn't working, and so some pretty big decisions have to be made. Either Greece and Ireland and Portugal bomb out of the euro, or perhaps the braver way of looking at it is that perhaps Germany ought to say that it's time that actually she took back the Deutschmark, she took back control over her own national life. I know that may seem unlikely at the moment, but how well I can remember coming to Berlin back in the 1980s when it seemed that the Berlin Wall would be there forever. And everybody thought the Berlin Wall would be there forever, but great events in history can happen very quickly. So I hope that at some point in time you really get the opportunity to say, as a modern Germany, that like us, you believe in cooperation. Like us, you believe in trading freely. Like us, you will sit round a table and we'll agree and we'll negotiate environmental standards. We'll agree and negotiate some minimum safety standards. We'll do all of those things, but that we will operate as our own functioning national democracies. That's the vision of the future. And I think there is a movement here in Germany, not just in this room, but I've been a fan for some time of Dr. Roman Herzog, your former president, who, if you remember, commissioned that study, didn't he, between 1998 and 2004, of what percentage of federal laws in Germany were made here as opposed to being made in Brussels. And it came up that 84% of your federal laws that were made between those years were not made by politicians that you can elect, were not made by politicians that you can get rid of and replace at another election, but they came to you straight from the institutions of the European Union. And Herzog himself said the question has to be raised of whether Germany can still unreservedly be called a parliamentary democracy. Well, clearly it can't, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll bring you other news from Brussels. Do not believe those that tell you that because we have a European Parliament, this project is democratic. It is not democratic. The people who have the sole right to propose legislation are the unelected bureaucrats in the European Commission. They are the people that design our laws. All we can do in the Parliament is to delay them a little bit. I'm often asked, well, Nigel, surely the rational thing, surely the logical thing is to fight to reform the European Union from within, to fight to democratise the European Union. And people say that, and they're genuine in their desire to push for it. But even to say that, ladies and gentlemen, is to fundamentally misunderstand what this project has been about from the very start. Jean Monnet, who was the author of this, hated the concept of democracy. Because with democracy, you have a government elected for a 4 or 5 year term, and they steer in that direction. But if at the next election you get a government of a different hue, they then veer off in another direction. Well, that's no good to people like Jean Monnet. That's no good to these great people who know better how we should live our lives than we do ourselves. No, these people have got 10, 20, 50-year plans. They've marked our futures out for us, and they do not want anything as inconvenient as democracy getting in the way. And that's where the Monnet method came from. That's where the sole right of the initiative of the European Commission came from. And if there was ever a moment at which this was going to be democratised, then it would have been at the time of the European Constitution. They could have used that opportunity to make the European Parliament the place from which the government of their new European state came from. Personally, I wouldn't have been in favour of that, because it still would have put, national delegations in a minority position. But they could have gone for it, and they could have put it to the peoples of Europe in referendums, and you know what? They probably would have won. But they didn't do that, did they? They kept everything absolutely the same. They synthetically made the European Parliament look a little bit more powerful than it was before, but the reality was that nothing's changed. And then, when the French said no, and the Dutch said no, they just chose to ignore them. And when little Ireland had the temerity to say no, they were forced and bullied into voting yes. That is the true face of this European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not just undemocratic, it is anti-democratic, and we, it is our great historic task to fight for our nations, to fight for our democracies, to fight for our children and grandchildren to grow up as free people. We've made a start in the United Kingdom with this, and I believe here today in Berlin, you have made a start too, and I thank you. You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.